The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Good morning to everyone here, and appreciate the member attendance that we had this morning as well. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Review of the Results of 2 Audits of the National Ecological Observatory Network. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement and then the ranking member. Today's hearing will focus on one of the National Science Foundation's most ambitious major research facility projects, the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON. We're fortunate to have with us the heads of 2 government organizations that are responsible for assuring that taxpayers get their money's worth from federal contracts with private entities like NEON. Our witnesses will discuss 2 audits of the NEON project conducted by the Defense Contract Audit Agency under contract with the National Science Foundation Office of the Inspector General. The NSF entered into a long-term agreement with NEON to develop and operate the project's network of more than 100 fixed and mobile sensors. This audit identified more than $150 million in unsupported or questionable cost in the NEON proposal. It concluded that there was not a, quote, fair and reasonable basis for NSF to enter into the contract. Nevertheless, NSF did not wait for the audit results. It instead finalized an agreement based on NEON's original cost proposal. Audits have raised questions about cost proposals that were accepted by NSF for several major projects. These include the Ocean Observatories Initiative, the Advanced Technology Solar Telescope, NEON, and currently the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. In response to these audits, NSF has made a number of adjustments to how the agency evaluates cost of major projects. But $150 million in unsupported and questionable cost in the NEON proposal demonstrates that major problems at NSF continue. Auditors discovered several highly questionable expenditures of taxpayer funds by NEON, including hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on lobbying, lavish parties, liquor for office happy hours, over $1,000 per month for premium coffee service, and trips to a high-end resort in France. These suspicious taxpayer-financed activities were not detailed in the audit submitted to the NSF Inspector General, which was limited in scope. But to his credit, the principal auditor, J. Kirk McGill, invoked the Whistleblower Protection Act to make sure that the Inspector General, Congress, and ultimately the public was aware of hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' dollars being spent on improper activities. I hope to hear from our witnesses on what basis NEON concluded, for example, that spending $25,000 for a holiday party last year was an appropriate use of federal funds. And why did NSF allow this to happen? Our committee may want to hear directly from the NSF and NEON about these audits at a hearing next year. Federal agencies must be held accountable for their waste and misuse of taxpayer funds, and the NSF needs to be held accountable for how they spend taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. The basic responsibility of any government agency is to act in the national interest. The NSF needs to meet that standard. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for her. Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have to confess that I'm baffled by today's full committee hearing. There may be legitimate policy and management issues for this committee to consider, but this particular hearing at this time is, in my opinion, premature, incomplete, and lacks balance. Therefore, it is impossible to have a full discussion on any of the legitimate oversight issues that we could examine. As I'm sure you're aware, Inspector General Lerner and NSF's Director, Dr. Cordova, have initiated reviews of NSF's policies and oversight of management fees, and those reviews are not yet complete. NSF is also investigating spending specific to NEON, and that is also underway. Today, the most we will hear in some preliminary observations from I.G. Lerner and Ms. Bales that NSF should consider tightening up its policies with respect to management fees. Perhaps the agency should do just that, but the October 2014 DCA audit report being reviewed today was not made available to NSF until 2 weeks ago, and it made no mention of management fees. So while the discussion was had at the staff level about inviting NSF, there was agreement that it was too late to reasonably expect the agency to prepare testimony for this hearing, and at the same time premature for the reasons I've already described. If we had postponed this hearing until next year, as my staff urged your staff to do, we might have included NSF on this panel to present their own findings and plans with respect to the management fees. We will also hear testimony from the witnesses about contingency fees. NSF senior management and IG Learner have been at an impasse on the use and management contingency fees for construction projects for 4 years. Both had the opportunity to share their views before this committee at a 2012 hearing. Since that time, OMB has updated its own guidance on contingencies. As my staff understand the updated regulations, some of the specific areas dispute, such as how contingency expenditures are tracked, should now be settled. There are other areas of dispute, such as how the contingency fund is managed, that remain open to debate among reasonable people. That is a key point. For these particular policy issues, there is no clear right or wrong. So how do we expect to have any meaningful discussion about these disputes today without the agency at the table to present and defend its own positions? Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a 2013 memo from NSF's Chief Financial Officer that provides detailed justifications for the agency's current policies. However, a document for the record does not make this a balanced, complete hearing.
Okay. With that objection, and at the same time, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put in the record the following documents that are in a binder I have here, and the title of the documents is the results.
I'd like to reclaim my time now.
Results of the 2 audits of the National Ecological Observatory Network. And without objection, both your request for documents in the record and mine will be so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And finally, it is with some reluctance that I offer the following observations. DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, was established to audit DoD contracts subject to defense acquisition regulation. I am concerned that they simply do not have sufficient staff with the expertise or experience to appropriately audit NSF's grants and cooperative agreements. My staff has heard from several entities audited by DCAA on behalf of the IG that the auditors repeatedly asked for the wrong documentation and made significant errors in their assessment of information. Further, auditors repeatedly failed to work with the audited entity in a transparent way that would have resolved significant costs that were later questioned in publicly available documents, including the IG's semi-annual reports. Having heard common complaints from several unrelated entities, I am unwilling to attach too much weight to any adverse findings by DCAA without further review. Unfortunately, problems with DCAA's audit have caused significant and ongoing tension between the IG and NSF management for several years, and have put creditable NSF awardees unnecessarily at risk. These problems also color today's hearing. Ms. Bales, please do not take my comments as a personal criticism. I'm just concerned that the auditing organization's skills fit the job when we are rendering judgments about the proper use of federal funds and questioning the performance of world-class research institutions and organizations. We don't even see DCAA testimony for this hearing until 5 o'clock last night. Mr. Chairman, I want to join you in conducting legitimate oversight of the National Science Foundation, but for the reasons that I have mentioned, I don't think this will be possible for today's hearing. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and I'll introduce our witnesses today, but I'll say preliminarily that I appreciate all the good work you all have done. I appreciate the fact that you are individuals of integrity and have contributed much to help us conduct our legitimate oversight responsibilities. Our first witness, Ms. Allison Lerner, is the Inspector General for the National Science Foundation and the Chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. Ms. Lerner previously served in leadership positions at the Department of Commerce and was selected by the President to be a member of the Government Accountability Transparency Board in 2011. Ms. Lerner received her bachelor's and her law degree from the University of Texas. She is certainly no stranger to the committee, and we're happy to welcome her back to the witness table. Our second witness, Ms. Anita Bales, is the Director of the Defense Contract Audit Agency. The NSF Office of the Inspector General relies on the DCAA to perform audits of National Science Foundation major research facilities like NEON, which the Inspector General reviews and submits to the National Science Foundation. Before her work at DCAA, Ms. Bales served as the Deputy Auditor General for Forces and Financial Audits of the Army Audit Agency. Ms. Bales received her bachelor's degree in Business Administration from Drake University and her MBA from Syracuse University. She is a recipient of the President's Council on Integrity and Efficiency Award for Auditing, and we're happy to have you with us today as well. And Ms. Lerner, would you begin?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I appreciate this opportunity to discuss 2 audits of the National Ecological Observatory Network and my office's efforts to help ensure that NSF spends taxpayer dollars effectively and for the intended purpose of advancing scientific research. We contracted with DCAA in 2011 to perform an audit of NEON's $433 million proposed budget to determine if it was prepared in accordance with federal requirements and formed an acceptable basis for the negotiation of a fair and reasonable price. From July through September 2011, DCAA issued 3 inadequacy memoranda stating that NEON's proposed budget could not be audited. The final such report found that none of the proposed cost elements for labor, overhead, equipment, and other items reconcile to supporting data. DCAA also found the proposal included more than $74 million in unallowable contingency costs and more than $1 million in unallowable honoraria. In February 2012, NEON submitted a revised budget proposal, which DCAA was able to audit. Despite working with NEON for several months to clear inadequacies in the proposal, auditors found a total of $154 million, or nearly 36% of the total budget, in questioned and unsupported costs. The entire $72.6 million proposed contingency was questioned. In addition, more than $13 of the $14 million in costs for materials and nearly $16 million of equipment costs could not be supported. Other question costs included $1.8 million in management fees for unallowable costs. As a result, in September 2012, auditors issued an adverse opinion stating that the proposal did not form an acceptable basis for the negotiation of a fair and reasonable price. Among other things, we recommended that NSF require NEON to submit a revised budget with support for all proposed costs. NSF disagreed with this recommendation and also stated that it would provide management fee and awards for the construction or operation of large facilities for years. In light of the problems with the NEON budget, we commissioned DCAA to audit NEON's accounting system. As the audit was proceeding, DCAA informed us that management fee had been awarded and used for unallowable costs, including $112,000 for lobbying and $25,000 for a holiday party. We investigated the allegations and referred them to the Department of Justice, which declined to accept the case for further investigation or prosecution. We have added a review of the award and use of management fees to our FY 2015 audit work plan. It is essential for cost information for proposed budgets to be accurate, current, and adequately supported because the budget is the basis for charging costs to NSF. The problems we found with the budgets were not limited to the NEON project. In fact, we found that NSF approved proposed budgets for 4 major projects, totaling more than $1.4 billion, although significant questions existed as to the adequacy of those budgets. As a result, while NSF knows what it will spend on these projects, it is not clear whether it knows what they should cost. As we work to resolve recommendations made in audits of proposed costs for NSF's large facility projects, we identified broader weaknesses in NSF's pre- and post-award monitoring processes for high-dollar, high-risk projects that compounded our concern that unallowable costs could be charged to awards. We recommended that, at a minimum, NSF increase monitoring for its largest cooperative agreements valued at $50 million or more. In our judgment, the actions NSF is proposed to take to address OIG recommendations in this area fall short of the standard necessary to adequately safeguard federal funds and leave millions of dollars at risk. As a result, in May, we escalated the unresolved recommendations. We took this step in light of the serious risk to federal funds posed by NSF's current processes and practices. NSF did not sustain our recommendation to require awardees to remove contingency from proposed budgets. We are awaiting NSF's decision on the remaining recommendations. We target our work to areas that pose the highest risk of misuse of taxpayer dollars and can lead to funds used inappropriately being returned to the government. To that end, our FY 2015 audit work plan includes incurred cost audits and accounting system audits of more than 10 awardees, as well as a focus on the use of management fees. Incurred cost audits are critical to proper monitoring and can reveal cost claims that are unallowable or unreasonable. We have been urging NSF for the past 4 years to strengthen accountability over its high-dollar, high-risk cooperative agreements for large facility construction projects. NSF applies its highest level of attention and scrutiny to determine the scientific merit of the projects it decides to fund. It is imperative that it apply the same rigorous attention and scrutiny to its financial management of these projects. The stakes are too high for the Foundation to continue its current practice of making awards before it ensures that project costs are reasonable, are supported by adequate documentation, and will use taxpayer dollars efficiently. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lerner. Ms. Bales.
Chairman Smith, Representative Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I have submitted written testimony for the record, and this morning I want to provide you a brief overview of DCAA and its audit role with the National Science Foundation and the National Ecological Observatory Network, which I shall refer to as NEON. DCAA performs contract audits for DoD components and other federal agencies to help ensure contractors comply with government contract regulations. Based on its audit findings, DCAA makes recommendations to contracting officers who then make final contract decisions based on their assessment of those recommendations. The National Science Foundation requested DCAA's help with NEON, a nonprofit organization required to follow the cost principles in OMB Circular A-122 for determining costs of grants, contracts, and other agreements. DCAA performed 2 significant audits at NEON. First, at the request of the NSF Inspector General in August 2011, DCAA attempted to perform a proposal evaluation of NEON's cooperative agreement for major research equipment and construction of the National Ecological Observatory Network. Despite significant coordination with NEON, DCAA was not able to perform an audit because of several inadequacies in this proposal. About a year later, DCAA began an audit of a revised proposal. While there were still major inadequacies associated with this proposal, DCAA was able to issue an audit report in September 2012. Of the roughly $434 million proposed by NEON, DCAA questioned about $102 million and concluded that an additional $52 million was unsupported. Question costs are costs the auditor considers not acceptable for negotiating a reasonable contract price or not acceptable for reimbursement. Unsupported cost denotes instances where the contractor has not provided specific evidence or documentation to support assertions. The inadequacies noted in our audit report were significant enough for us to recommend that the proposal not be considered acceptable as a basis for negotiating a fair and reasonable cooperative agreement price. It is also important to note that our proposal review of NEON was different from our normal forward pricing reviews in 2 respects. First, we were asked to review the proposal more than 7 months after the cooperative agreement had been awarded and a price established. Normally, contracting officers request a proposal audit before the award so they can make use of the auditor's recommendations to negotiate a fair and reasonable price. Second, we were asked to perform the effort for the NSF-IG. Audit requests normally come from contracting officer who is responsible for awarding the contract and has the ability to make changes in response to the recommendations. In addition to the forward pricing proposal and also at the request of the NSF-IG, we reviewed NEON's accounting system and issued our report in October 2014. Our audit disclosed a material noncompliance with NEON's timekeeping system. Specifically, NEON's actual timekeeping practices did not comply with its written policies and procedures. Our audit also disclosed 2 material noncompliances with Circular A-122 that were corrected during the course of our fieldwork. First, NEON failed to comply with the requirement that organizations receiving more than $10 million in federal funding of direct cost in a fiscal year must break out indirect cost into 2 broad categories, facilities, and administration. Prior to our audit, NEON had reported these indirect costs together. Second, NEON excluded unallowable costs from the general and administrative overhead base. Unallowable costs must be included in the G&A allocation base so they absorb their share of an organization's indirect expenses. Our fieldwork verified that NEON corrected both of these conditions after we identified them. We also issued a management letter to the NSFIG that recommended potential improvements in NSF's internal controls over contract costs. In closing, let me assure you that we are committed to providing NSF and all civilian agencies with high-quality audits that protect the interests of the American taxpayer. Moving forward, we would like to work with NSF acquisition, our grants managers, and the IG through the normal contracting process to provide comprehensive contract audit services for NEON and other NSF contractors. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today, and I will be glad to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bales. Let me recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And while I'll direct my first question to Ms. Lerner, Ms. Bales, if you'll respond as well, and we'll go back and forth. Ms. Lerner, the question is this. In my opening statement, I cited a number of examples of what I would consider to be the misuse of management fees. And let me just focus on one. By the way, the total cost of this misuse of management fees, in my opinion, is close to $500,000. I mentioned one. Let me go back to that. And that was a holiday party last year that cost $25,000, which amounted to about $140 for every person who attended. Other agencies have written rules against using taxpayers' dollars for these types of expenditures. Does the National Science Foundation have any similar kind of rule? And if not, why not?
I'm not aware of any specific rules that the foundation has. Obviously, cost principles that would apply to the awards that are funded by the foundation would generally prohibit expenditures on parties and foods.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Bales, do you want to add anything to that? I might add that, for instance, NASA has a rule that prohibits the use of dollars for anything like this, and other agencies have similar types of rules. But do you have any recommendations for the National Science Foundation?
In terms of the holiday party, it was covered by the management fee.
Yes. And
because that's not considered a separate cost, we didn't look at it as a separate cost and looked at it as the management fee. If the cost of the holiday party had been reported separately, we would have questioned that. Our recommendation would be to look at the use of management fees and what is covered by management fees.
It's my understanding that for the last several years, the National Science Foundation has been on notice that a lot of its management fees were being used in ways that would not be considered appropriate and has ignored past audits, at least until a few days ago when I think because of this hearing they decided to look at some of their practices. In any case, the fact that they were warned for several years and did nothing is troublesome to me. Do you see the National Science Foundation as following best practices when it comes to the use of management fees? Ms. Lerner?
Our office, in an attempt to illuminate a kind of murky issue, prepared a white paper that looked at the history of management fees in the federal government. They go back about as long as I do, to 1960s. And because of the lack of clarity about what management, they're intended essentially to help entities that primarily do business with the federal government, and that in order to maintain financial viability need to have some ability to be reimbursed for expenses that would ordinarily be unreimbursable. Okay. So they are intended to reimburse unreimbursable expenses, but there has been controversy over time because no one has set limits on what those normal and ordinary expenses should be, and sometimes you find situations.
Don't most agencies set limits, but the National Science Foundation has not?
I don't know that anyone has concrete limits. I know some people, the Department of Defense looks very carefully at the amounts that are proposed. I don't know that they've set actual limits. We did not identify any concrete limits on what you could use use a management fee for in our effort to assess the landscape.
Other than in the example, then in the specific examples that I gave you, clearly those would be inappropriate if they had been itemized.
It's hard for me to see that a holiday party is a normal and ordinary operating expense.
Thank you. Ms. Bales, let me ask a couple questions and direct them to you first. Let's go to the subject of construction contingency. That's normal practice. You set aside a certain percentage for contingencies, 18, 19%, sometimes 20%. But what's different about the National Science Foundation here? And if you'll go into a little bit of detail in regard to NEON, their contingency, I think, started at 60 million, went up to 74 million. To my knowledge, those expenses were not justified, were not itemized, and were not documented, which I think is fairly highly unusual. But if you'll just comment on the practice of the National Science Foundation when it comes to the way they handle the construction contingencies.
The National Science Foundation has guidance that allows for the use of contingency in budget. So as part of their budget process, they will include, here's the cost, and then here's an amount for contingency. And when that money is then awarded, or the cooperative agreement or a grant is awarded, the money goes to the awardee, and then there are practices in place where if there has to be, say, the limit is over $250,000 and it needs to be reallocated, that then has to be approved by NSF management. So.
And what about the increase from the 60 to the 74? And was that documented, or was that were they sort of operating without many rules or restrictions?
When we did the proposal audit and looked at those contingency fees, part of the issue was the basis for how much was being included in the contingency was not well documented.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bales. That concludes my time. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lerner, on August 21st, 2014, the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense released an evaluation of DCAA's quality control system. The review found numerous instances where DCAA failed to properly document its audit conclusions as required by the generally accepted government auditing standards and the statements on standards for attestation engagements of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. This resulted in DCAA receiving a rate of pass with deficiencies, indicating that DCAA still has serious work to do in order to fully comply with the relevant professional standards. On September the 8th, 2014, the DODIG released a report that found one or more significant deficiencies in over 81% of DCAA's audits from fiscal year 2012 and 2013, sampled as part of the review. On September the 17th, 2014, Kellogg Brown and Root Services Incorporated, KBR, filed a suit against the U.S. government in federal court seeking to recover $12.5 million in legal fees incurred by KBR in defending against findings from a flawed DCAA audit. Were you aware of these significant adverse findings regarding the quality of DCAA's audit work, and are you at all concerned with relying on DCAA audit findings in your own work? I'm sorry?
Sorry about that. A pass with deficiencies is not the outcome that anyone would seek in a peer review process. So that is a matter of concern. But when our office has DCA do work for us, we have audit monitors that oversee the work that they do and you know, I feel that if they had identified issues, we would have followed up with DCAA and attempted to ensure that that those concerns were addressed. So it is a matter of concern, and but I do think we have some controls in place where we attempt to ensure the quality of the work that is done for us.
Ms. Bales, committee staff have heard from numerous entities audited by DCAA auditors in the last few years that there were significant communications problems that resulted in millions or hundreds of millions in questions cost In some cases have already been resolved down to a few $100,000. We've heard the same type of complaints from all of these entities, namely that the auditors were unclear or incompetent in their request, and that they failed to work with an audited entity in a transparent way that might easily have resolved the misunderstandings that led to significant question costs. In the meantime, the reputation of world-class research institutions have been put at risk, given that there is one common party here, and that's DCAA. I'm inclined to attach significant weight to these complaints, and I'm concerned that DCAA does not have the staff expertise or experience with grants and cooperative agreements or with the science construction projects. Are you aware of these complaints from these entities audited by your agency on behalf of NSF-IG? Or have you taken any steps to address the concerns going forward?
I am not aware of the specific complaints that you're referring to from the NSF entities that we've audited. No one has raised those to me. However, over the time frame, we have entered and issued what we call rules of engagement to our audit staff that does encourage them to communicate with both the contractors or grantees that we audit as well as the contracting officers to make sure that as we go through our audits, everyone is aware of what we're doing, that we issue draft reports and findings and have those discussions as we go along so that if there are issues that may be misunderstandings, that we have those discussions as we go through. If specific complaints do come to my attention, we respond to those and look through them and see is there really a valid complaint there and how do we work through that.
So you've not heard of any of these complaints?
Not the specific, I mean, you're talking complaints specific to NSF, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you haven't heard about any?
None of the NSF awardees have come to me to say that my auditors are not working with them and that they are not understanding what we're saying.
Thank you. You bet.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing. I think that our oversight responsibility is of tremendous importance to the people of the United States. If they are to have faith in their government and faith in this Congress, they have to know that we are doing our job, and this oversight hearing is part of the job. And the task of these witnesses today is to ensure that the American people know that their hard-earned money is not being wasted. And quite frankly, attacking the people who are doing an investigation is not a refutation of the findings of an investigation, or does it justify any type of let's say, holding back on the part of investigators. In fact, we should be encouraging our investigators rather than trying to find fault with them. Let's find out whether or not what they have to say is something that is going to be significant to the taxpayers or not. In this case, what we have here is 36% of a budget was found to have an unacceptable level of accounting. This budget was $434 million, and that is a very significant sum for American people who are struggling to pay their own bills at home. So no one should be making light of this or trying to focus their efforts on undercutting the people who are trying to see if we're spending our money correctly or not, or our taxpayers' money correctly or not. Now, it seems to me that what we have here, this is not a complaint over the other side of the aisle. It seems to be that this was too late and it was premature at the same time, this investigation. Well, I guess too late and premature means it was just about right. So let's get down to some of the details here. But let's make it very clear. The money that we're talking about here, this 36% of the budget, that money out of a $434 million budget, that reflects money that comes directly from National Science Foundation research funds, does it not?
It does.
Okay, so what we're talking about here...
MREFC funds.
Okay, well, so what we're talking about is important research funds that have been allocated for research that may have been going to lavish parties, to trips to various places, lobbying, as well as lobbying efforts, that we have using taxpayers' funds for lobbying efforts, and lavish Christmas parties. This is very much important for us to look into, because it sends a message to other government agencies that we don't want, not only do we not want our research funds misused, but we don't want any government funds to be misused simply because we're going through contractors here. Let me ask Ms. Lerner, when your office raised these issues with the National Science Foundation about the concerns about this major research facility costs and the costs described in your testimony, has the National Science Foundation done anything in response to your findings rather than trying to attack you as the investigator?
They have made changes. When we started looking at contingency amounts, initially the threshold for which NSF approval had to be sought was $250,000 to $200,000 for many awardees. So, most amounts were under that. When we surfaced this issue, NSF did lower the amount that
so now people don't have as much discretion.
Exactly.
Okay, that's
fine.
So
they did do that.
Well, did you find that the National Science Foundation either explicitly or implicitly allowed NEON, the group that we're talking about now, this contract that we're talking about, to use these management fees for lobbying or liquor or lavish Christmas parties or any of the other expenditures that are very questionable?
The record the record reflects that NSF approved a management fee for NEON, and NEON used that management fee for. Did they
know when they approved it that it was going for questionable purposes, or is this determining, or they didn't know?
I believe that the first tranche of management fees, the first year's worth, were paid after the fact, and there was some awareness on NSF's part for what those expenditures were for. In subsequent years, they were provided a percentage, and I don't know that the agency had clarity as to how the management fees were used in those years.
Yeah, sometimes there's a willful not knowing certain wrongdoing is going on. And Ms. Bales, has the DCAA ever identified the use of management fees for lobbying?
No, we haven't.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for holding this hearing.
Okay. If the gentleman will yield, and I know his time is up, that's a subject for us to revisit, because about $250,000 was spent in lobbying fees, and had it been itemized, I think it would have been very, very improper, but we'll get to those distinctions in a minute. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. And I want to echo the comments of the ranking member in her opening statement, indicating that there are some very much legitimate oversight issues that the committee can be pursuing with regards to the management and cooperative agreements for large facilities at NSF. I do wish that NSF was here today, and that I understand that some of the reports that we're discussing are preliminary, and so I hope that there'll be another opportunity to dive into this in a more comprehensive way, rather than just being able to touch on the initial findings at this point and making sure that there's a balance to the hearing. Ms. Lerner, if I can direct the first question at you. You had mentioned in your testimony the need for projects such as NEON to obtain updated cost estimates before being approved for funding by the agency. The design and development of any large facility accounts for roughly 10% or more of the total project costs, I believe. At NSF, these costs are deducted from the research account, I think as one of my colleagues pointed out, which means that there are, in fact, fewer research grants. some significant fraction of that cost is developing rigorous cost estimates, so estimates in order to make those for those studies. Even if we use a conservative estimate, about 10 to 20% of those design costs, you're still talking about millions of dollars a year. Updating those estimates takes a significant amount of time, effort, energy, financial resources, money. Perhaps sometimes months, because it requires project management to go back again to each and every one of the vendors and continue to redo these estimates. So when it comes to managing project risk, isn't there a trade-off between approving potentially outdated cost estimates and the increased cost and time required to update those estimates over and over and over again, particularly for a major project for final design review? There's also analytical tools available to develop reasonable costs and models for escalation for a final proposal, and NSF, I believe, makes use of those tools. So any estimates that is still just an estimate when there's obviously some risk involved. In their final analysis, NSF has concluded that the trade-off that I've mentioned favors moving forward with the project, even with price quotes that might be a bit outdated. You seem to have come to the opposite conclusion, and I'd just like to understand how you arrived at that conclusion. Is there any OMB guidance on a date of expiration for those cost estimates for construction projects that says after 6 months, a year, 18 months that should be reevaluated?
I'm not aware of any specific hard and fast time frame. But I do think that some of the concerns that were found in the audits that were conducted for us were when estimates were used that were 4 and 6 and 8 years old.
If I can ask, what do you think would be a reasonable time frame in order to reevaluate those costs? Would it be 6 months, a year, 2 years? Do you have some basis in there to say, or are there external factors that you look at? The economy, inflation, what triggers that reanalysis?
I think it's probably not a one-size-fits-all because different costs you have to look at differently. But I would say, you wouldn't want to go, I think you could definitely go back a year and potentially even 2 years. But when you are back much beyond that, then the quality of the estimate is weakened. And I think the important thing is when a final decision is made to fund a project, that you have a really good sense of what that project is going to cost. And what we have seen is because of the risk, one of the reasons that we have large amounts of contingencies is to address uncertainties with respect, to costs over time.
So if I understand you correctly, just so that I do, you're saying that there's essentially no one-size-fits-all, that it's in no particular factor that you can point to say this should trigger a reevaluation or not, but kind of a totality of the circumstances evaluation of it. Can you point to any particular factors that would go into that analysis to provide some guidance to NSF or anybody to say these are the factors that we should be looking for before we make this reevaluation?
Certainly, I think you want to look at the age of the estimates. You want to look at the quality of the estimate. Sometimes there were costs that were questioned because there was the cost was a portion of it was supported by an estimate, but a portion of it was just kind of someone's best guess as to what things would cost. And so the more you're relying on concrete cost-related data to support your costs, the greater the likelihood is that you'll have a good idea of what those costs should be.
So you're calling into question the initial estimate because you're saying that wasn't done properly?
In some instances.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Buchan, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lerner, were these reports preliminary as been described, the reports that you've done?
The audits that were issued by DCAA were not preliminary. There were some initial inadequacy memos, but then the final 2012 audit was final, and the accounting system audit is final as well. Okay, so to clarify again, the reports are final reports, not preliminary evaluations. And as far as that goes, whoever wants to take this, did the NSF know that money was being spent for lobbying services? I believe that there was, in the first year of the management fee in the NEON project, there was a statement that certain funds would be used for government outreach, I think was how it was characterized. I don't know if NSF read that and understood that to mean lobbying. I'm not sure that they saw more than that particular document.
Okay, so that information was available about, I mean, I have the breakdown here in front of me.
Right. That's from the accounting records of NEON.
Is available.
Yeah.
I don't have any other questions, but I'll make a brief comment. I'm looking forward to the next Congress and the testimony that will be provided to the committee by NSF. As most of you know, I was the chairman of the Science Technology Subcommittee, and on that subcommittee, there has been some resistance from National Science Foundation as it relates to transparency, and I hope that does not continue. For example, in some instances, we've been asked to come to National Science Foundation to review documents rather than have them released, and at that time, much of what is in the documents has been redacted. And so I do think that Congress has a very important oversight role, and I fully support the National Science Foundation's ability to make judgments on which scientific studies should be funded. All I think we're asking for is the justification, and that is part of our oversight, which is extremely important. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Buchan. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here at the committee today. There are few issues that spark the ire of our constituents more than the potential misuse of their hard-earned tax dollars, and we hear about that. So I hope at least we can clear up some of those concerns today. I do want to start by aligning myself with Ranking Member Johnson's comments and Mr. Kennedy's comments about the need to have a more balanced hearing to hear from the NSF. So I want to say that I hope we can really have a more balanced look at this situation. I want to say that the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, is an ambitious project, we know, with the potential to yield significant advancements in our understandings about how humans interact with the planet, including the potential threat posed by invasive species. This includes collaborations with academic researchers across the country, like at Oregon State University and my home state, where they've looked at the impact of temperature variability on the release of carbon from soils. Deepening our understanding of the Earth's natural processes and the impacts that human beings can have on those processes is essential, and I hope that this hearing will yield some constructive solutions to assist the NSF in developing NEON. So I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of NEON. I want to start with Ms. Lerner. In your testimony, you stated that when DCAA notified you about the use of a management fee for unallowable services, you referred the matter to the United States Department of Justice, but they declined to accept the case. Were you given any reason from the DOJ to explain why the case was not accepted?
I don't believe that we were. I mean, sometimes, there are any number of reasons that the Department of Justice chooses not to proceed with an investigation, and I don't recall that we received explicit feedback on that point.
And I want to follow up on Ms. Johnson's line of questioning a bit earlier. In preparing for this hearing, I've heard concerns from various entities that DCAA may not have the technical competency to accurately assess a major science construction project like NEON. And as you know, and with due respect to Ms. Bales, DCAA was established to audit DOD contracts. And in fact, when I was reading Ms. Bales' bio, it really talks about the Department of Defense. So did you ever consider having a different auditor look into this particular project? Can you follow up on that a bit, discuss that?
At the point at which we were doing these audits, we were primarily using DCAA for that type of audit support. We have other options now. But I would say I've heard many concerns, and some raised in this hearing, about the approachability and the interactions that DCAA auditors had with NEON and with other auditees. And I went back and spoke to our monitors, and I just want to clarify that there was a great deal of conversation and back and forth between my staff, the foundation staff, well, both from the program and from the Budget Finance and Accounting Division, NEON and DCAA, about what the purpose of the audits were, what the findings were. When we had these series of proposal audits done, that all came to a conclusion with a lack of with real concerns raised about contingencies in particular. We heard back from the auditees, we have the information. DCA didn't ask the right questions or talk to the right people. And so we said, all right, if there was a process foul, we'll go back. So we sat down, all of us, and talked about those 3 awards, and then we went back to each of the entities to do a deeper dive. And we had a great, people from all the concerned parties around the table at the initial deeper dive. We sent audit folks to Denver to meet with the NEON staff. DCAA representatives were there, NSF folks and additional people from our office dialed in from Ballston, and I believe even the financial statement.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I
right.
just have a few seconds left.
Sure.
And I want to.
Sorry, but there was a lot of communication.
Understand. Ms. Bales, during the initial audit of NEON's accounting systems, DCAA found 8 instances of noncompliance with federal requirements, including the use of management fees for some unallowable costs. But in the final 2014 audit, only 1 instance was included, and that focuses on timekeeping and did not mention management fees. Can you explain why the initial findings did not make it into the final report, please?
Specifically to the management fee, that was really not totally within the scope of an accounting system, but once we saw that the management fee was being used for those type of expenses, we can't not report that, so we reported that in a separate memorandum, and rather than including it in the report related to the accounting system because of the scope of what an accounting system audit is. And the other findings, we identified 2 findings that have been corrected by NEON during our field work. And there were other findings that, as we looked through the supervisory review process, that there needed to be additional work, and that work was done, and they were not continued to be supported.
Thank you, and my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Ms. Bales. Given the number of issues that were discovered in the NSF audits, how does that compare with other audits that have been done by DCAA?
Other audits, just in general?
Other agencies, do they have a similar number of issues that are significant or questionable with unsupported costs?
It's really very different based on contract to contract, organization to organization, and it's hard to make a general conclusion in terms of the number of problems because there's just such a wide range of different types of audits that we do and different contractors. We do frequently find issues as we go through contracts in terms of the same number. That's really hard to answer.
In general, though, were these? Do you find this across government? Is this an epidemic that we have?
When you say this, do you mean the management fee type issues, or?
Yeah, all of the things that you found in the audits, that were found in your audits.
We do find, frequently we find problems with accounting systems, and we work through those. We find often, one of the things is we're working through a lot of proposals. We have a lot of inadequacies. As we talk with other contractors, we say one of the things that you as the contract community can really help us out in doing our job is making sure that your proposals are adequate. So different inadequacies in proposals are common.
Well, let's talk about the proposals then. Is it normal to audit a proposal and then have that proposal accepted before the audit's finalized?
Normally, no, because again, as the purpose.
Why was that done here then?
When we accepted the audit, in talking with the NSFIG, there's still the ability, even though the cooperative agreement had been awarded, there was still the ability to have an impact on the price, so they could go back in and make an adjustment. But normally we would do that ahead before the negotiation happens on the issuance of a contract or a grant or an award, because as we look at that proposal and we find different things to question or that aren't supported, that provides the contracting officer or the grant manager the ability to go into that negotiation with information that allows them to really do a good negotiation to get a fair and reasonable price. If the contract had been finalized and there wasn't the ability to reopen and go in and make adjustments to the price, then we really wouldn't have a value to add in reviewing a proposal after it had been awarded. But there was, as the IG indicated to us, an ability to go back in and affect the amount of this cooperative agreement.
Okay, this question is for Ms. Lerner or Ms. Bales or both. In reviewing the audits, what appears to be the source of the issues? I mean, is it Neon for not doing a sufficient job of maintaining the books, or is it the NSF for not conducting the responsible oversight? Ms. Lerner, would you care to answer that?
I think ultimately the costs proposed are proposed by Neon, and they were not supported in ways that they should have been to be compliant with OMB Circular A122. I would imagine that Neon would say that what they were doing was compliant with NSF's Large Facilities Manual, but the Large Facilities Manual and the cost principles should both support each other and not be in conflict.
So to answer that question, you think it's more on Neon's noncompliance with the standards for accounting?
I mean, ultimately it was their proposal. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to. They have to be the ones respond. They were the ones who made the proposal. NSF had a role in providing guidance through the Large Facilities Manual, but it was Neon's proposal.
Thank you. And Ms. Bales, what's your opinion of that?
I would agree with Ms. Lerner. In terms of the proposal, it is the responsibility of the service provider to put together a proposal that can, from our perspective, be audited and allows the contracting officer or grant manager to know what's coming in and be able to make a decision on.
Thank you. I yield back 1 second.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. My colleague from Texas, Mr. Beasley, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Ms. Lerner a question. Ms. Lerner, according to the NSF, the agency sustained $20 million in question costs from Neon's proposal. This contradicts the statement that you made in your written testimony when you implied that NSF upheld the full proposal in April 2014. NSF further told us that they have been unable to take any steps to reduce Neon's total budget accordingly because you escalated your finding to the agency's audit follow-up official, who must now weigh in before any further action can be taken. Were you aware that NSF, in fact, sustained nearly $20 million in question costs?
We are aware of that now.
Okay, and also I wanted to ask you another statement that was made a little bit earlier. I understand that you feel very strongly about your views on contingency funds, and of course there's been some disagreement, with that. When you had the opportunity to make your case before the OMB, it seems to me that you were overruled. Is there a specific OMB regulation that you believe NSF to be in violation of? And I actually have a copy of the text if members would like to see it, but just wanted to get your opinion on that as well.
If you look at are you speaking about the new provision in the uniform guidance?
Which one? The covert? Okay, it was December 26th.
Right. It's the uniform guidance.
Yes, right,
and
exactly.
The change that was made there added a section B that speaks specifically about the ability to have contingencies and budget estimates. And that has never been the concern of my office. Our concern has been with the final provision of that that section, subpart C, which says payments made by the federal awarding agency to the non-federal entity's contingency reserve or any similar payment made for events, the occurrence of which cannot be foretold with certainty as to the time, intensity, or with an assurance that they're happening are unallowable. What we see with contingencies at NSF is that they accumulate them at WBS level by WBS level into a large reserve. And the contributions to that reserve, many of them don't meet the certainty requirement that's set forth in that subparagraph. And so that has been our concern. We have never taken the position that you cannot have contingencies in a budget. Simply that when you make a contribution to a reserve, there needs to be certainty as to the factors set forth in the principle.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, let me just kind of, if do you mind, very quickly, if I can just read some of this statement from you a little bit earlier. This is, I'm going to read directly. Let's see. Some commentators recommended additional provisions for further clarity on the types of costs that are allowable for contingencies and recommended additional controls on how federal agencies provide oversight over these funds. In particular, commentators suggested adding a requirement to track funds that are spent as contingency funds throughout the non-federal entities' records. The COFA reviewed the language and concluded that it does provide sufficient controls to federal agencies to manage federal awards. The COFA noted that through a diversity of techniques that are available to establish contingency estimates, the estimates must be based on broadly accepted cost estimating methodologies. Budgeted amounts would be explicitly subject to federal agency approval at the time of award, and funds would be drawn down unless in accordance with all other applicable provisions of this guidance. Actual costs incurred must be verifiable from the non-federal entities' records. The COFA considered this last requirement to be sufficient for tracking the use of funds, as contingency funds should be most properly should most properly be charged not as contingency funds specifically, but according to cost category in which they naturally fall. The COFA did not recommend any changes to the proposed language.
Well, with respect to the statement that the contingencies have to be verifiable from the non-federal entities' records, that's an area where we've had concern, because while we can look at a change log and see that the awardee says that they're going to expend contingencies in certain amounts on for certain purchases, we can't verify that those expenditures were actually made in the financial records of the awardees. And so that's been an area of great concern to us. When you have $77 million worth of contingencies that it will be expended, but we can't determine how they're expended in the actual accounting records, that's an area of risk, because people can say that they're going to expend it one way and then expend it another way, and we won't be able to tell. They can also hide, cost overruns or in ways that we won't be able to see. So we do have concerns about the ability for to verify the expenditures from the non-federal entities' records.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And look, for many of us here, we start to delve into this and we're concerned because we want to see NSF be successful. I mean, this isn't beating them up. This is sort of doing our constitutional duty, but also, it's an organization that is important when they hit their mark. Ms. Lerner and Ms. Bale, how long have you been in, shall we say, the auditing business?
Well, I've been in the IG community since 1991.
Ms. Bale?
I've been auditing since 1984.
Okay, so you've sort of been doing it forever.
Yes.
Nothing personal on that.
Okay.
I'm actually married to one of your kind. So should I at least be a little bit surprised, and maybe I just was a little sensitive to it, some of the reaction of beat up the auditor? I mean, how often have you had that experience where instead of digging into saying, okay, here's how we could fix this, It's, no, let's beat up the auditor. I was just a little surprised at the tone of both some of the questions, but also some of the things I've seen written. Has that been an experience in the past? I mean, shoot the messenger?
Well, having been an auditor forever.
It's nothing personal.
No, that's fine. Auditors, I mean, no one is comfortable when an auditor comes into their house. And so we do tend to be a target when people hear maybe what they don't want to hear. So there have been times when throughout my career I've been like, well, you just don't understand. You don't have the expertise. You're coming in. So it's not unusual to hear that, but then it's our responsibility to go back and show this is how we know what we're doing. This is our competence. These are the regulations that
But if you've been doing it since the mid-'80s, sorry, you've probably seen everything. And Ms. Lerner, have you ever sort of had this sort of personal sort of pushback?
Before I was wearing the audit hat, I was a lawyer. So I've experienced pushback.
Is that 2 strikes against you?
Pretty much. One more, I don't know what will happen. So you have to have a really thick skin and a strong stomach to do what we do. And,
But how do we
sign up for it.
Convince our brothers and sisters around here? We're actually doing this for love and success and protecting the taxpayers and the agency. And sometimes we've got to have these honest conversations. Ms. Bales, okay, your specialty has been a lot of defense contracts.
Yes, I've been with the Defense Contract Audit Agency for about 3.5 years.
In modern defense contracts, as you review their success, their compliance, what would happen if it was a defense contractor that was spending money on alcohol and other types of, let's call them externalities? Would that be tolerated on that side of the world?
If we were to, audit a contract and see that there was a cost that was reported that was alcohol, use that as the example, we would question that cost as unallowable. And this is one of the differences between FAR 31, which covers the defense world, and to kind of respond to the issue about our competency to look at science foundation contractors because they're not defense. We do understand that FAR covers much more in detail than what OMB A122, which covers the science foundation contractors. But because A122 does not have that spelled out of what is expressly unallowable as the FAR does, but OSD would respond to the FAR and it would say alcohol is expressly unallowable. And
so this was nothing personal, wasn't it?
Absolutely not.
I mean, this is just standard practice of how you would do your job.
Correct.
In the way you designed your audit, okay, you pointed out the number of sins and the misappropriations and some of the failure to manage the contractor, but within that, didn't you also provide a series of suggestions of how to solve this problem in the future?
We did, because, one of the reasons, because there was a management fee and that these expenses were covered by a management fee, we did not question them as unallowable because once the management fee has been awarded and there has been the determination from management to attach an award fee or a management fee in that award, we have to audit to the terms of that collaborative agreement, contract, grant. And because the management fee was awarded, there are no restrictions on what the management fee can be used for.
Mr. Chairman, forgive me for going a few seconds over line. Did you audit in depth sort of the design of the contract?
The design in terms of...
the reporting requirements, the design, the protocols, the mechanics within the agreement?
I would say we don't audit that in depth because
from what you've seen, should we go back and delve into those contracts and really break them open and do a sort of a forensics within those contracts?
In terms of what costs were incurred we would, at the end of any cost type contract, we would advocate that a good oversight is to come in and do an incurred cost audit that covers both indirect and direct costs to make sure that the costs were in accordance with guidance and in accordance with the agreement.
So that's something we can look forward to in the future.
We could.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, this is a question. Well, first of all, let me just say to Ms. Lerner and Ms. Bales, you all do this for a living. Is that right? Do they pay you to do this?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Do they take, and I don't mean to pry, do they take taxes out of your paycheck?
Yes, sir.
Yes, they do.
Okay. And you're okay if they double the amount they're taking out? Or would you rather government be run as effectively and efficiently as possible to mitigate any taxes they might take out of your paycheck?
You know, we're in the business of trying to pursue an efficient government.
That's a simple yes.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Efficiency, effectiveness
Yeah,
is what we look
absolutely.
at.
So you have a vested interest when you're doing this. And there's something called generally accepted accounting principles. What do y'all call that, GAAP?
Yes.
Okay. And so y'all are experienced in that. And so when you go in and you look at this way, it's kind of like Dave Schweikert, my colleague over here, said, you know, we're doing this for the right reasons. We want to make sure that our taxpayers' dollars are expended in the wisest, bestest use. That's probably not good English, but that's what we want. And so I appreciate y'all doing that, and I, too, echo his comments. It saddens me that sometimes the messenger gets shot in that endeavor, but thank you for doing that. It seems as though it should be a standard operating procedure for any federal agency that commits $400 or more billion to a construction project to have a cost proposal audit and resolve those problems before that construction begins. And then also to have a post-construction audit of actual expenses. Now, that just seems to be a good generally accepted accounting principle to me. I own an air conditioning company. I'm a business guy. Would you all agree with that?
I would. In terms of what we do our audits, we think that we can add good value before the audit is awarded by, again, providing information to the contracting officer to be able to go in with a good negotiating position. And then after the fact, to make sure that the costs were accurate and allowable, reasonable, and allocable.
Okay, I may have misspoke. 400 million. I'm sorry, but go ahead. You know, 400 billion here, billion there. As soon as we're real money. Ms. Lerner, what do you think?
I agree, and we've made both of those recommendations to the foundation for its large, high-risk, high-dollar construction agreements. You know, step up both the pre and the post-award oversight.
Are there plans to perform an incurred cost audit for NEON and the other NSF major projects? Do you know?
You know, do you mind if I look at my? Is that in our audit plan for this year? What's that? Okay, we're looking at management fee for this year, but I would assume that down the road we would consider auditing, doing incurred cost audits in some of these large construction agreements. But we aren't the only ones. The foundation can also do that. It's not just an oversight responsibility, it's a management responsibility.
Are you making that request to them, or are you making that a strong suggestion to them?
We suggested in our alert memo on large cooperative agreements that they do require incurred cost submissions and that they undertake incurred cost audits for those types of awards.
Hopefully, if they hadn't had too much alcohol on the taxpayer dime, they were able to read that and digest it. Okay. Question for Ms. Bales. If a pre-construction cost proposal audit for a DOD project disclosed huge amounts of unsupported and or questionable costs to that particular project, what happens to it?
We turn that information over to the contracting officer, and they use that information through negotiations. If the proposal is grossly inadequate, they would probably go back to the contractor and ask them to fix the proposal and fix the inadequacies in it so it could be used to negotiate.
Do they come back to y'all for approval for the changes they made? Or input, I guess I should say input by y'all?
The contractor? Mm-hmm. Yeah, if they went back and redid their proposal, it would come back to us to audit again.
Okay, and then you have the ability to say that looks better or it looks the same or worse. Maybe.
Yes.
Okay. All right, and Ms. Lerner, in answer to your question, 3 strikes, I guess you could go to work for the IRS, but yeah, I'll leave that alone. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. That concludes our questions, and let me thank both witnesses for their insightful answers, which are very much appreciated. And the responses that we got in your testimony today was both informative, enlightening, and sobering. And clearly, problems within the National Science Foundation have existed for many years. And let me say that the new director has only been in office for 8 months. I believe that she wants to correct these problems, and I'm hopeful that they will be corrected. But clearly, the problems have been there for a long time. And as I say, I'm hopeful of being able to work with the director and being able to address some of the deficiencies that you all have mentioned here today. Thank you very much for your testimony, and we'll look forward to staying in touch.